Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's installment of our ongoing Lunch Bites series. My name is Samuel Holliday, and I have the great pleasure of serving as Director of Operations and Scholarship for the United States Capitol Historical Society. And we're so glad that so many of you took the time out of your busy day to join us as we engage in a really fascinating discussion with a prominent author. But before we get into today's book talk, I'd like to go over a couple of brief technical housekeeping matters. We love using this Zoom webinar platform to engage with your audience. It gives us a few ways that we can interact, primarily through the Q&A section. That's where if you have any questions for Dr. Banner during the course of today's program, you could submit those questions in that Q&A section of the platform. It looks like two speech bubbles, either at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on what device you're using to join us today. Now, if at any point you feel like you're having some technical difficulties, if it seems like you're having problems hearing us or seeing us, you can put those queries into the chat section of the webinar, which I will be monitoring and answering in real time. So once again, any content-based questions for Dr. Banner can go into the Q&A section of the webinar platform. It's now also my great pleasure to introduce the President and CEO of the United States Capitol Historical Society, Jane Campbell, who will be moderating today's talk and fielding the questions to Dr. Banner on your behalf. Jane?
Thank you, Sam. As always, thank you for the work you do to bring these webinars to our folks. We are coming into the summer series and finding that those folks who are still determined to check in for our Lunch Bites series to get a little bit of history during your lunch hour, we are so grateful for your time, your attention, and for the fact that you've joined us. As you know, these are recorded, and so if you find this fascinating and you'd like to share it with another friend and colleague, the recordings are available for anyone through our website. We will be sending a newsletter to all those who are registered for this event that gives them the link to the recording within the next day or so. So look forward to that. I also want to give you a little bit of tease here. Our author, who is speaking today, Dr. James Banner, has written a book, and he's going to be speaking about his book, which he has arranged through Yale University Press, the publisher, that our listeners might get a 15% discount on the book if they purchase it with the link that will be in the follow-up notice. We will also have that link in the chat room if you feel compelled to order it immediately while you're hearing the conversation. So let me share with you an introduction of Dr. James Banner. Dr. Banner is a distinguished historian and an expert in how to teach history and how to understand the profession of being a historian. Dr. Banner was educated first at Yale and then got his PhD from Columbia, where he studied with the famed historian Richard Hofstadter. He was a member of the history department at Princeton until 1980, when he left to found the American Association for the Advancement of Humanities. He has been a distinguished scholar in so many areas and a prolific author, from To the Hartford Convention, the Federalist and the Origins of Party Politics in Massachusetts, which he published in 1969, bibliographic essays on Blacks in America, published in 1971, Understanding the American Experience in 2 volumes, in 1973, The Elements of Teaching and the Elements of Learning, both published by the Yale University Press. And the book he's going to talk about to us today, called The Ever-Changing Past, Why All History is Revisionist History. And for those of you who want to see, here's what the book looks like. And I thought, as we introduce him, it's always my practice to try to share something from the book that I thought might be useful for our time. As he talks about the fact that all history is revisionist history and tries to put that in context, he uses the continuing attempt to understand the American Civil War. and what really went on and what were the causes. And he sets forth the following theory, that contemporaries exert such lasting influence over what the general populace thinks, as well as what historians write afterwards, may frustrate professional historians, many of whom like to believe that the arguments about the past should remain with them. Yet in fact, the battles over history's meanings typically start with contemporaries and participants, and rarely do their arguments stay within the bounds of professional discourse. Everyone has much at stake in these interpretive settlers. So that gives you a sense of why Dr. Bannon believes that the ever-changing past will tell us why all history is revisionist history. So our plan for today is that Dr. Bannon will talk to us about his book and his findings for about 20 minutes. And we will then go into a series of question and answers. I, of course, have some questions, but I invite you to add your questions into the Q&A, and I will moderate those questions, and we will have a dialogue. And as usual, we will be done at or before the 1 o'clock hour. So that being said, Jim, tell us what you've learned in your years as a historian about the ever-changing past.
I will do my best, Jane, and thank you, and thank Sam and all of those, your members, and those who are present. This takes me back a bit, by the way. I have a history with the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. It was Fred Schwingel who worked with me many years ago in trying to get underway what has eventuated in being the National History Center of the American Historical Association. And I spoke with an annual dinner of the society about that some years ago. And I'm also an author in one of the books in your extraordinary publishing series. So I feel as if I know a good deal about the society, and I'm a big booster of it. I want to talk very informally about the subject of revisionist history, and not about the book itself, but really about the subject. And I want to make very clear that I do so from above the arguments themselves. I'm looking at the phenomenon of revisionist history from, as we now say, 30,000 feet. I have scrupulously in the book, and I try when I'm speaking with an audience like this, I try to stay out of the fray myself. Surely I have strong views about this, that, and the other issue, but today I'm trying to present to you what I think the phenomenon of revisionist history is. And I start by pointing out that my book is the first one in 92 years about this subject. The one 92 years ago was a very good book, but doesn't speak to us. So I've really had to organize and reorganize the subject for myself. And I'm certain that some of my colleagues, and maybe some of you, will disagree with the way in which I have gone about it. And the subject is fair game, I'm fair game, and I'm just exploring with you the way that I have come to see the subject of revisionist history. Now, all of you have no doubt heard that phrase. These days, it seems to be a charge launched at the left from the right, but that has not always been so, which is one of the points that I want to make. And it's such a tossed about term. It is used both irresponsibly as well as responsibly, that I'm not certain that it's a very useful term, but we're stuck with it. Somehow to say that any history is a revisionist history, and in my view, all are potentially so, and a good proportion, well, maybe above 75%, turn out to be revisionist in one way or another. To say that a work is the work of revisionist history is like saying that ice is cold. I mean, it doesn't get you very far. You can't have ice without it being cold. And my argument in some respect is that you can't have history without its likelihood of being somehow a revision of what has gone before. Now, what is revisionist history by my definition? Well, it's any challenge to existing interpretations of any aspect of the past that is brought about by new evidence, new arguments, new perspectives, and new methods. Now, that's a very capacious definition. And again, you might want to have me narrow it. You might want to narrow it yourselves, but that's the definition that I'm using as I think about the subject and as I speak with you today. Now, I want to start with 3 or 4 points that to me are indisputable. And the first is that revisionist history has been with historical inquiry from the start, which means, in effect, that the way in which, at least in the West, and I'm only going to talk about the history in the Western world, the way in which we in the West do history, revisionists, the prospect of changes in interpretation and in argumentation are inherent in historical inquiry. Now, Herodotus we take to be the father of history. And he was a man of omnivorous curiosity, writing about 2,500 years ago about the wars between the Greeks and the Persians. He absorbed everything in his way of going about interviewing people of the wars that hadn't been over for that long a time. And he was interested in burial practices, songs, military campaigns, politics, tribes, everything imaginable. He was an omnivorous social cultural historian. And his younger, near contemporary, Thucydides, came along and said that Herodotus had gone about the business of writing history for the first time in the West the wrong way. So right there, within the lifetime of these same two men, we had the beginning of arguments about how history should be done. And it is for this reason that Donald Kagan, the noted historian, now emeritus on the Yale faculty, the historian of classical times, has called Thucydides the first revisionist historian. And so it is wrong to think that somehow revisionist history blew up in the 1960s and 70s on the left or any other place. I mean, it's really been with us since the beginning. And I also want to point out in the second place that if you're trying to total up, you're trying to create a ledger of victories and defeats between, say, the right and the left, or the conservatives and the liberals or the leftists, you are going to have to accept the fact that in the two great changes, the two great moments in Western historiography, the right won, if we want to total up victories and losses. Well, by that I mean the following. Thucydides, writing about men, wars, statecraft, politics, set the template for the way in which historical inquiry was pursued and historical teaching was practiced for 2,300 years. It really wasn't until the middle of the 19th century that anything that we would recognize now as social, cultural, intellectual history began to re-enter historical thinking, with which it had begun by Herodotus 2,300 years earlier. So that's my first point of reference when I say that the right, if we think of conservative, if we think of an orthodoxy, the orthodoxy in Western historiography really started with Thucydides. In the second place, the first great transformative change in the way we look at the past in the Western world that took place in the 4th century was the creation of Christian historiography, whose great progenitor was Eusebius, the Bishop of Caesarea, a town that maybe some of you have visited on the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, what is now the Palestinian and Israeli territory. Christian historiography is the template in which all of us see the past. It's a past with an origin point. It's a past that progresses through time. And of course, it's a past that's defined in Christian terms. And if that isn't conservative, to use an anachronistic term to be sure, but if that doesn't represent, again, part of the Western Orthodox tradition of historical thought, I don't know what is. So I think everybody should relax that about when you hear that revisionist history is something on the right or the left. It comes from all over the place, from the right and the left. The right and the left both win victories. They're usually temporary. They may last for 1,700 years, but eventually they wane and they wax. And so it doesn't make much sense in the larger scale of things to worry about revisionist history because it's really with us all the time. It also has to be said that there are many different kinds of revisionist history, and one should keep that in mind. They're the transformative changes in history brought about by Eusebius, and I would argue with analogous strength and penetration, but not really from two people acting as historians. The transformative scale came in with Marx and Engels also in the 19th century. And then there are lesser kinds of revisionist histories and arguments. There are arguments that are philosophical, which were really the arguments between Herodotean and Thucydidean history. Which is the best way to do history? Then there are arguments within certain camps as to how historical progress is to be made. Here I cite as an example the way in which historians of women, most of whom, but not all of whom are women themselves, continue to argue about how one should conceptualize and see the history of women in the Western world, throughout any place in the world, in the United States, in the District of Columbia, or wherever it may be. So these are the kinds of arguments that come about as perspectival arguments, how best to make progress in understanding the past. Then there are changes and arguments that arise from the discovery of new evidence. Take the Dead Sea Scrolls. Take the discovery, the proof of discovery of the site of Viking settlements at Los Omedo in northern Newfoundland. Those kinds of discoveries churn up what we thought we knew of the past and create new perspectives on it and new entry points into further research. Then there are new technologies. Take DNA technology. It's DNA which is fairly conclusively made clear that Thomas Jefferson fathered children with his slave concubine, Sally Hemings. We could not have determined that or ascertained it or argued it with any strength until about 25 or 30 years ago, because we didn't have DNA technology. We didn't have the machines and the knowledge to take up an analysis of other evidence, because we didn't have access to those means before. And then there are what I would call normal revisionist history. Let me give you an example from my own work, my own first book. It was about the Federalist Party and the Federalist Party, particularly and specifically in New England. And I took up that subject because it seemed to me that the scholarship on the origins of politics in the early Republic, in the capital cities of New York, Philadelphia, and then here in Washington, in the very building whose history the U.S. Capitol Historical Society is dedicated, that was being written in Jeffersonian terms, and that we could not adequately fill out and understand the history of the early Republic unless the Federalists were brought back in. And the Federalists had already sort of lost the ideological war. Thomas Jefferson was the reigning idol. I was not trying to argue that the Federalists were better politicians, more major figures, or anything of the sort. I just wanted to get them into the picture so that we could enrich and more deeply understand our early national history. So certainly my book was an example of revisionist history. I didn't intend it as such. I was just trying to enlarge understanding of history in those 25 years after 1789. Whether I succeeded or not is another matter, but certainly that was revisionist history. And then I think we must keep in mind the matter of scale. Surely changes in our understanding of a small Civil War battle in, say, Eastern Tennessee is not going to transform our understanding of the causes, of the consequences, of the realities of the war between the Union and the Confederacy. That's not at stake. But let me take an example that I made up for the book, and I made it up purposefully to illustrate a point. We have a small battle in Eastern Tennessee. It is always assumed that the Union forces won it because they had superior soldiermanship and superior firepower, and they were better led. Fair enough. But then a cache of letters are discovered written home by a Confederate soldier. And in those letters, he makes clear that the reason that the Southern forces in that battle struggled so much is because orders from headquarters had not arrived, because the horse on which the courier was coming with the orders got lost. So we understand now that the Southern forces lost that battle not because of inferior marksmanship or inferior leadership, but because they were not adequately provided with suitable orders and reinforcements and so on. Now, that changes our understanding of that battle. What difference does it make? Well, it makes difference maybe to the families of the people who had ancestors in that battle on both sides, maybe those people who reenact it every year on its anniversary. So it's a matter of scale when we talk about revisionist history. Certainly those letters provided a new interpretation, a deeper understanding of that battle. That's not going to churn up the general understanding of the Civil War in textbooks or in narrative histories of the Civil War. But it does represent a revision of previous understanding and interpretation of that event in the Civil War. Now, you might ask me, well, what difference does all of this make? Is this just something that professional historians, academics in particular, like to do? It's like reading tea leaves if they don't have anything to do, if they don't want to play golf or play a couple of sets of tennis. They sit and they argue about how to interpret that battle in Eastern Tennessee. Well, that's not all that's at stake. I mean, historical argument bears fruit. I don't want to argue that historical arguments have uses. They certainly do, and we, people, humans, use history both responsibly and irresponsibly to make arguments. But I'm talking about what comes out of arguments over the past. And in the book, I use two examples, and I think it's worth mentioning them here. One is the historiography of the French Revolution. The arguments within France about how the revolution got started, why it went sour, what legacy it left, turns out to have been an argument which helped create the French notion of the French people. Historians weren't responsible for helping the French to define what it meant to be French. But historians made a contribution to that as they argued over who was responsible for bringing on the revolution, for sustaining it, for losing it, for trying to regain it in 1830, and then in 1848, and then in 1870, 71, and so on. But one of the fruits of the coming of, say, universal suffrage in France clearly had something to do with the way in which liberal and Marxist historians had argued about the meaning, the consequences, the universal fruits of the French Revolution. Another example I use is it concerns a set of events that many, perhaps most of you, remember in about 25 years ago in the mid-90s, right here in town. It was the debate over how the display of the fuselage of the Enola Gay, the airplane that dropped the bombs on Hiroshima, how they were to be interpreted in the National Air and Space Museum. And you may recall that that exhibit just blew up in terrible explosion of interpretive enmity. The exhibit, in the end, never took place. It was done in a terrible fight between professional historians and military veterans of the Second World War and the Air Force Association. So what you might ask me, why would I illustrate this as one of the fruits of an interpretive battle? Well, because it brought before the public, inasmuch as the debates and the fracas over that exhibit that never took place on the front pages of newspapers and in television reporting and so on. So the country was exposed to this debate about how the past was to be presented. Was that a good thing? Well, it depends. I mean, if I want to take sides, which I'm really trying to avoid here, but I'll expose my own views about that event. I thought it was a terrible tragedy that the general public was not exposed to the ways in which historians had been arguing about the consequences of the bombs, whether they were the right use of ammunition, whether we had to have dropped them, whether there were options, and so on. Historians and others had long been arguing that. The public was really prevented from seeing those arguments. However, members of the public wanted to come out in choosing those arguments. On the other hand, the debate itself, it seems to me, from civic grounds, was exceedingly useful in exposing the public to the ways in which you could think about the past and the choices that professional historians have and participants in the Second World War have and veterans of the Second World War have and how they differ among themselves also. In other words, it was illustrative of what I think is something that we should cherish, and that is the capacity that we have in a free, open, democratic society to disagree with each other and to constantly argue about the meaning for ourselves of the past as well as the present. And I want to conclude with just one other observation, and that is, because you're likely to ask me, well, come on, Jim, if you're saying this, how do we have any confidence in there being objective history? Well, I don't think we can have much confidence in there being something that we call objective history. We know too much now about memory, about perception, about the nature of historical thought itself, to think that we can ever arrive at a closing point about any single issue of the past. We historians are always striving to move asymptotically, closer and closer to that final closing point out in some distance way out in the universe. We never get there. And I think it's best for us to think that when we think about the past, we should be thinking about progress and enriching our understanding, but always keeping in mind the possibilities that all of, or many, and maybe most, of the interpretations of certain events and circumstances and great developments in the past are open to debate. There are many different ways to seeing them. As long as those interpretations are plausible and hawser themselves to evidence, we historians should be pleased, and you should be pleased too, that it's part of the texture and the possession of us all in an open society such as our own. Jane, let me stop there and take questions.
Well, thank you, Jim. It certainly gives us a broad range of history to review. As I think I shared with you, our audience, and you know our audience because you know the Historical Society well, is quite opinionated on matters of history and has thoughts and ideas. And one of our listeners has offered that your assertion that DNA proved Jefferson's paternity has been challenged, that in fact the DNA can simply ascertain that someone related to him was the father of Sally Hemings, and that perhaps it was his nephew. Would you like to comment on that sense of
yes,
changing history?
Yes, indeed. There are some people who believe that the case is not closed, and I think that probably is true. But there seems to be agreement among historians as well as genetic scientists that Madison Hemings was a direct descendant of Thomas Jefferson. It was not Peter Carr. I think the best books to go to on this subject are those of Annette Gordon Reed. I urge any of you interested in the subject to read her books. The whole controversy starting back in the 1960s that sort of opened up the subject of Jefferson's paternity of children with Sally Hemings is really a fascinating one in and of itself. It reveals how historians learn more and more and begin to piece things together and genuinely make progress in understanding. But whoever asked the question, I would acknowledge that there are still openings for debate, but I think that the Jefferson's role in fathering children with his slave is pretty well established, at least through the Madison Hemings line.
And so let's move to another question, which is there's quite a debate that is raging even now about how do we deal with difficult history of this country? How do we tell the story of the Holocaust and the Americans' response or lack of response to the Holocaust? How do we tell the story of the Confederacy and all that went on in terms of slavery as we are dealing with the statues in the Capitol? Some of the Confederate statues are being removed as states determine that those individuals should not be highlighted as the persons of honor. But yet that is a component of our history. From your perspective as a historian, how might we deal with, telling the difficult history of our country?
That's very complex. Let me start with two propositions. One is that we should be arguing such matters, and we're free to argue them as we feel we must because of our heritage, because of our beliefs, and so on, our politics, our ideologies. We've got to start with the facts as to who the people who are being commemorated were, what they did, not how we look at what they did, but what they did. And we've got to always start from the facts. The second of all, I think that some authority has to be reposed in professional historians. After all, we shouldn't, I think, turn for advice as to equities investments to someone on the street. We turn to people who are professional investors, investment counselors, stock traders. The same thing, we do that with medical research. You're not going to ask me to a question about how we're likely to solve the problem of the huge varieties of cancers, you're going to ask a medical researcher who knows a lot about cancer. And the same thing with the past. I think this professional and particularly academic historians are likely to know the most. Now, that doesn't mean that they will agree on how you interpret the evidence, but they're likely to know what the evidence is and how you should use it and interpret it. So those are the two, I think, firm bases for thinking about the past. As for the rest, that's up to you. Whether you think that Bobby Lee should stay in some town square or be taken down, that's up to you. Because that has to do with the way in which you look upon the South or the North, or whether the Southern cause was just, or whether it was legal, whether it was constitutional, whether it made good sense, whether it did the nation any good. Those are questions that historians are not expert in. We have to see those to you, citizens, to non-historians, to thinking people, and you have to argue it out. But I think historians have the right to ask that you at least come to us first to get the facts straight and to understand what others have argued about what you're arguing about, so that you're as fully informed and you're as fully armed, you have as most ammunition available to you that is considered to be authoritative ammunition as you can. Then it's up to you. And those are civic questions, and Jane, I think, have to be answered by our fellow citizens that cannot, should not, must not be ceded to historians. Those are matters for people living in communities, voters, and so on. So I'm trying to stand above the fray. I don't want to talk about, who's right, the North or South. I have my own views, but that's what I'm trying to avoid talking about today.
Well, let's take a look at, your assertion that the facts are immutable and identifiable. We now have a situation where we have people challenging the facts. We have a discussion about alternative facts, and what would be your thoughts on the difficulty in agreeing to the facts?
Well, it depends upon what the facts are, Jane. For example, there's no way to deny that the Stamp Act came into force in 1765. There's no way to deny that the Declaration of Independence was voted on favorably by the Second Continental Congress on July 2nd, 1776, and made public 2 days later. Them's the facts. There's certain things, however, that we just simply don't know, and that human perception isn't up to fully comprehending. I bring to your attention a now celebrated film clip. It was run by two psychologists. It's available somewhere on the web, and my wife and I were exposed to it. It's a group of people, men and women, tossing a ball, a big ball, among themselves, just tossing it back and forth. The video ends. My wife and I were in an audience of 250 people watching this film clip. And the person who was showing it to us said, okay, now, did any of you see anything else? 2 hands went up, and those hands were not mine and not my wife's. And what did these 2 people see? They saw a gorilla-clad woman walking among the people tossing the ball. But none of us had been primed to see that clad figure. Only 2 people had seen it. This is what psychologists call inattention blindness. So that means that all the accounts we have of, say, the storming of the Bastille are partial. They're incomplete. We have some of the facts, and we have to interpret what they mean, because just because there are people who say that 2 people climbed up the wall of the Bastille doesn't mean that 3 didn't. We have no idea what those 2 people were doing. Were they attacking? Were they trying to rescue people? In other words, that's where the interpretive need enters. And so we cannot often agree on what those facts are. We know that people were climbing the walls of the Bastille, but beyond that, we cannot be certain. And that's where we have to try to triangulate all of the evidence we have. Sometimes it's supplemented by newly discovered evidence, and make of it what we can. And our views of evidence like that change with our own circumstance. And this is something, Jane, we haven't talked about it, but you yourself mentioned it in what you quoted from me at the outset of this hour. And that is, we are the people we are. We are born in the groups we are. We live where we do. We're educated as we're educated. We have the minds and we have the dispositions, the temperaments, the personalities that we do. And we cannot expect everybody to agree and to see evidence and to see the past. I think all that we can ask is that all of the interpretations that are based upon fact and evidence, plausibly argued about and accepted, are admitted to the courtroom for all the rest of us to try to make heads or tails of. That's about as good as we can do. We're never going to come to agreement. There's never going to be agreement that something is objectively certain. Everything is provisional, partial, approaching truth, but never getting there.
Now, we have a question from someone who I know you know well, Chuck G. Giacomantonio, who was the chief historian for the Society for a number of years. And so his question is, how much is digging in on a single historical perspective that doesn't challenge your position on this, that, or the other? How much of that is the fault of the historians whose work remains inaccessible because it is not written in a manner that is easily readable by the citizenry?
That's a good question generally, and I'm not surprised that it comes from the source it does. Let's see. There are specialists in every field of endeavor. We do not expect physicists to write in terms that readers of Parade magazine will like to see on Sunday morning. And all historians don't do that either. And some of us write about very small matters of the past, which unbeknownst to the general public do help as building blocks do to a wall or of a newly building house to contribute to our understanding of larger phenomenon. I've been engaged in that kind of work. Chuck has, some of the rest of you listening have no doubt been also. We historians, though, I think most of us understand that we also have an obligation, particularly in a society like our own, to reach out for the general public, to make our knowledge available to Mr. and Mrs. America. That's what I am doing now. Chuck has done that. A lot of you have done that in your own fields. And that's to bring the knowledge that we possess, that we have created, that we may have gained from others, to everybody's, to make it a general possession of the public. So I think that all specialists go in and out. They're specialists doing work that very few other people read and learn of, but that what they have unearthed and what they've argued then become embodied in the soil, in the footings of available historical knowledge. I think of this like geological strata. You have earthquakes and they throw the strata up at a slant and suddenly things are exposed underground, different kinds of rocks and minerals and bones and fauna and flora, everything. And it's always available for use, for discovery, for application. And so the arguments of the past never go away. They're embodied in the arguments of the present. They may be rejected, but they still are available for use, to be pulled out and used in a different fashion. And that's the kind of complexity in which professional historians like Chuck and myself operate.
So if you were to give advice to those persons who are trying to create a civic engagement that is more collegial, that allows us to bring our differences to the table, resolve things, and move forward. Much of that is based on people's really differences in understanding of both the past and the present. And what advice would you give to those persons who are in the civic sphere seeking to have a common understanding that will allow a base agreement in order to move forward to establish policy?
Well, again, for example, it is illegitimate and it's contrary to fact to argue that the Holocaust never took place. So you've got to rule out the ridiculous, the radical, the incomprehensible falsities that a few people, not many, utter. Then there are going to be what we all face throughout our lives, and that's disagreement. And so as long as we can create a kind of receptacle, a kind of a field, an arena in which we agree what the boundaries are, and then we're arguing about what's inside of it, then it seems to me we have to expect that people within that arena are acting out of comity, out of reciprocal courtesy, are acknowledging the strengths as well as the weaknesses of arguments with which they disagree, and come themselves to understand what the field of legitimate disagreement and uncertainty is. We can't get much closer, but it's when arguments are freed of the evidence of what most people, eyes and minds can accept, then that's when we have trouble. That's when things become illegitimate. But within the boundaries that I've set, I think we have to accept the fact that life itself is ambiguous and that it's uncertain and that it's never complete. And we go to our respective deaths in some existential way unfulfilled because we don't have answers to everything. And if we have answers, they are answers that satisfy us, but clearly they don't satisfy everybody. And the same goes with historical arguments, historical facts, historical presentations. And so the works that you read, the works of history that you hold in your hands and read, you should always approach as being provisional. You know, one way to look at the subject about which you're reading. They're not the only way that those subjects have been approached before. They're unlikely to be the way in which those subjects are approached in the future. And they're no doubt not what you're reading is not the only way that historians now approach the past right now. So don't take any work of history as being absolutely certain, absolutely true, apodictic, universally accepted among historians themselves. Chances are it isn't. And if it is today, by virtue of consensus, I wager in 100 years, it won't be.
Well, I guess that is a perfect summary statement for the fact that we must all live with ambiguity and that the past is constantly being revised because we're understanding the meanings. And what I've seen just in my time since I was studying history when I was in college as a history major, that one of the debates and arguments we were having at that time was that history had failed to present the role of women in history.
Absolutely.
And that there was more to the story that could be told. And as we began to look at history to include women, that changed how we looked at history. Similarly,
that's a perfect illustration. I mean, in my lifetime, I've been a professional historian since 1960, when I entered graduate school. So it's over 60 years. And our understanding of American and Western history has been absolutely transformed by the introduction of women, African Americans, all kinds of ethnics, gay and lesbian people, the disabled, laboring people, people who scarcely left any historical record. Our understanding of the American past is so much richer, fuller, and it continues to gain speed and texture and thickness, precisely because of the example, which is only one among many others, that you mentioned. For me, it's been extraordinarily exciting, but I have a personality clearly who embraces this kind of thing. Some people don't, and that is again one of the ways in which historical argument gets presented and made by people of different kinds of temperaments. But for me, what has happened since, Jane, when you and I were in college is absolutely extraordinary. And my children are the beneficiaries of it. It took me as a professional historian to get easy with it and to understand it. Others are now being taught that routinely, which has got to be good for their lives and for our country.
And so we move into our continuing understanding of history, the mission of the United States Capitol Historical Society to present the history of the Capitol, of the people who work in the Capitol, and the influences that there are upon the people who work within the Capitol. One of the fascinating things that we have done as the Historical Society, we've had the honor to create the Cox Corridors, which are inside the Capitol on the House side, that were a gift from the Historical Society to the Congress, and were done later than some of the other art in the Capitol, and therefore have things like the westward expansion, which is not depicted in many of the other art in the Capitol. And so as we look ahead to the programs of the Society, we will be returning to Steve Livengood's lively presentation of the Cox Corridors at our next lunch bite on June 15th. So we come to the conclusion of this conversation with you, Dr. Banner. Thank you so much for being with us. We will share with people the information, here you go, about how to get your 15% discount if you want to look at Dr. Banner's book. If you can't capture this on your screen, do not fret. It will come into your email box in the next day and a half. We are extremely grateful for your time and your talent, and thank you for sharing it with us, Jim.
You're very welcome. It's been very nice to be with all of you.
It's great to have you. And now we turn to upcoming events. I mentioned that we return to Steve Livengood with his analysis of the Cox Corridors. Coming up on the 15th of June, Lunch Bites is going to take a break to celebrate the birth of the country on June 29th, as the 4th of July break is coming up at different times for different people. So we will be reconvening again later in July, but we certainly want to make sure that you have an invitation to join us in 2 weeks to talk about Lunch Bites. And we do remind you that the More Perfect Union series, which ran from October all the way through May, all of those seminars are available on our website, and we invite you to take a listen at a time that is convenient to you. We once again thank you for your contributions to the United States Historical Society. While we are chartered by Congress, we are not funded by Congress. We are funded by the gifts of members, friends like you, who offer the support because you believe that although, as Faulkner says, reminded by one of our dedicated listeners, the past is not even the past, but the past is important. One of our historians who's on the Council of Scholars said, "It is not that the past is repetitive, it's that the past has echoes." And so we learn from the past, which is why we want to keep continuing how we can move forward to become the democracy that our founders set forth and the democracy that our children and grandchildren deserve. Thank you very much for being with us. We look forward to talking with you again in 2 weeks. Be well. Have a good week. Goodbye.